like to make a few brief comments in honor of Tisha B'Av about Har-Bayit, the Temple Mount, and some things that it seems Tanakh and the Torah are trying to show us about how to understand its significance and what we ultimately are supposed to be trying to do there. So I'll start by just laying out a few different pieces of data, a few different observations, and try to do this in relatively rapid fire. And then we can make a few comments on what it all might mean. So there's different ways you could imagine starting this off, but I think maybe the easiest thing is just to begin with the topic of threshing floors. The word used in the Torah and also in Tanakh is goren for a threshing floor, which is a place where you're separating the wheat from the chaff after your sheaves of grain have been cut down, and you're in the process of harvesting, and eventually you're going to get flour out of it, but in between you have to get the kernels and separate them from everything else. And it's in the context of the ancient Near East, it's usually kind of a flat circular area, and you're sort of beating and dragging and tossing the grain in such a way that you're using the wind to separate the wheat from the chaff. You're doing winnowing. And the word goren appears in various places, but the obvious starting point for why we would talk about a threshing floor is that in the description of how David HaMelech, King David, acquires the Temple Mount, Har-Bayit, he purchases it from someone named either Arwana or Ornan HaYevusi, the Jebusite. And he purchases it after a plague occurs and strikes the nation. And so there's a whole sort of background and subplot going on there. This is both in Sefer Shmuel and also in Divrei Yamim, in the book of Chronicles. And events are described slightly differently. But in any case, the point is that the Temple Mount is a threshing floor. It's a goren. It's described as such when David purchases it. And that could be an incidental detail, although I think when it comes to the subject of Har-Bayit, of the Temple Mount, it's hard to treat any detail as incidental. So one has to ask this question of why ultimately does Hashem want his name to be placed on this location that has this particular property? It could have been many things, right? It could have been a gold mine. It could have been, even with something more connected with agriculture, it could have been a wheat field, but it's a threshing floor. So it's a place where people are not growing the grain, but where they're kind of in the process of finding out how much of their grain they really are going to have after all the winnowing, and they're going to have this pile of what can be ground into flour afterwards. So we've talked a little bit about this before, I think in another Shiur, that this must have been in the ancient world in general a kind of place where you were very interested in avodah zarah or magic, because you're finding out how much food you're going to have to eat for a good part of the rest of the year. And so anything that could influence the outcome of that observation, it's very tempting before you find out how wealthy you are to try to sort of stack the deck for yourself through the use of magic. And so it's perhaps not at all surprising that an idolatrous cult of some kind in the ancient world would get very interested in what's going on in the threshing floor and maybe make it a center of some kind of worship or the practice of some kind of magic, divination, etc. Well, the question is, if that's the case, why would it be the case then that Har-Bayit would end up being such a place? Meaning, why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu want such a place to be chosen as the place where he's going to be worshipped? Because at first you might think you would want the complete opposite of that. if this is the makom avodah zarah, in its status quo ex ante, like before we involve Bnei Israel, why would we want to taint whatever it is that we're doing by producing all of this confusion about whether this is something new or whether we're carrying something forward? And this is a legitimate question in history, right? Because you see, for example, in the New World, in the Americas, there are a lot of old Catholic churches that were built on the sites of American Indian pagan worship. And in some cases, that led to direct conflation of Aztec or Mayan gods with the saints of the Catholic Church. And it goes to show that there are a variety of instances where if you geographically co-locate, you can end up just kind of carrying forward whatever avodah zarah was going on beforehand into whatever it is you do. And it seems like you wouldn't want that if you're going instead to go the unique and correct path of Am Yisrael, according to the Torah, which is to leave behind the idol worship of other nations and go their own way with Hashem. However, it's hard to avoid the sense that the text is trying in a deeper layer in the subtext to suggest to us that there's a bit of this kind of thing happening in the background. There are a few different kinds of suggestions that we can see in just the sources that we were just talking about. So one of them is that we have the name of this Jebusite who's selling Harabait to David. And he's either called Arwana, so Aleph Reish Vav Nun Hey, or he's called Ornan. Ornan is in Divrei Yamim, and Arwana is in Shmuel. And if you look at the name Arwana, it's sort of, first of all, it's basically an anagram of the name Aharon, or because it has a Vav in it, which Aaron in the Torah is not usually spelled with, although the vowel would be suitable for a Vav. You also can spell Aaron or Ha'aron with it, right? So the two things you get from Arwana, if you jumble the letters a little bit, are Aharon and Ha'aron, meaning Aaron, the brother of Moses, the first high priest, and Ha'aron, the ark, meaning the ark of the covenant, the ark of the tablets that's at the center of Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies in the temple. So this Jebusite, who is identified with a tribe of Canaanites that David has conquered Jerusalem from relatively recently, somehow is only friendly and cooperative with David when David shows up. He bows to him, he happily sells him, he volunteers to provide the ox and the or the oxen and the sort of yoke that he has there for the construction of the new temple, although David refuses that, which is this, it's touching on this issue of, is it okay for us to carry things over from what was there? So at that level, we don't want items that might have been involved in avodah zarah to be carried forward, but this fellow Arwana doesn't seem like a bad guy or that he's opposed in any way to what's going on, at least reading, at first blush. And his name has the suggestion of this already was almost the right thing. The right thing is Aharon and Ha'aron, right? It's Aaron and the ark. That's the correct thing that's supposed to be going on in Harabait. And this Jebusite who's there that sells the place to David is just a few clicks away from that, right? You just you move the letters around a little bit and you're there. And I think that the text, is pushing that under our nose a bit if we're just a little bit sensitive to the possibilities. And really, this goes back further and is something that maybe Chazal were learning partly from this source, but also from a source in the Torah, because they say the name Yerushalayim is really coming from Shalem, where Melchizedek, Melech Shalem, the king of Shalem, Kohen El Elyon, the priest of the high God, who meets Avram in Emek HaShaveh way back after Avram defeats the army of Gedolei Omer and Nimrod, midrashically, and is returning the people of stone to the king of stone, that Melchizedek is supposed to be a priest of Hashem, and he's the king of Shalem, and the Shalayim in Yerushalayim is identified by Chazal with Shalem. So there's already this notion with Chazal that they're getting from Chumash even, and not from Tanakh, or not from Nach, let's say, from the rest of the Hebrew Bible, that there is this correct monotheistic worship of Hashem going on in Canaan in the time of Avraham. And it's identified with the place of Yerushalayim. And then the Yeru from Yerushalayim comes, according to Chazal, from Hashem Yireh, the name given to Har Habayit in the Akedah, in the binding of Isaac. And so you get this conflation of, or combination of these two sets of sounds. So it's Yerushalayim, and you get that from Yireh and Shalem. So when Chazal are saying this, they're referencing, I think always when they say things like this, they're referencing what they see as enough evidence in the text of the Torah, in the text of Tanakh itself, that these themes are there. And it might be that this other point about Ha'aron and Aharon and Arwana is part of that same theme, the idea that really, although on the one hand, there's something unique and distinctive and new and different and singular and kadosh about what Am Yisrael are supposed to be doing, that it comes from, or that it's related to, or that it's not so dissimilar from, they're not so dissimilar to something that did have an address in Canaan, and in fact may have had the address of Har Habayit. Which also helps to explain other midrashim from Chazal about the eternal significance of Har Habayit, right? That you have all of this midrashic association of Har Habayit with Adam and Chava and Cain and Hevel and Noach, and going down through the generations. And so, if that's possible, if Chazal are getting at something, they must be referencing at some level the idea that this was a place that mattered to correct worship of Hashem, perhaps at some level, even before we really were able to first establish a Beit HaMikdash, that Hashem picked the place at some level. And it wasn't just David decided, okay, this looks like a good place to build a temple to Hashem, it doesn't matter where, or at least I'll make the judgment, and then from that time on, it will have some kind of permanent status. So I think that's the first simple point to make, is that you get something interesting from the name Arwana. Interestingly, though, there's this other name Ornan, which is given in Divrei Yamim for the same person. So instead of Arwana, he's called Ornan, and the question is now, why is he called Ornan? What is that referencing? And it's hard not to think of, when you see those letters written without the vowels, Ornan, that it's very similar to Arnon. And Arnon is a place. It's a place that you hear mentioned frequently in the Torah, especially starting in Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, because it's a place where Bnei Yisrael are east of the Yarden, east of the Jordan River, preparing to conquer the land. They end up getting in this war with Sichon and Og, these kings of Bashan and the Emori, who wage war against them, and they defeat them. And so we get these lands in the land of Gilad that become the lands of Reuven and Gad. But whenever that's mentioned, we almost entirely, every time you also hear about Arnon or Nachal Arnon, and we eventually realize that this is also, similar to where Yavok is, which is where Yaakov crossed over from Gilad. But the thing that's mentioned, maybe not 100% of the time with Arnon, but quite frequently in these initial mentions of the word, is Moab. And really, Moab is a theme that comes up a lot also in Sefer Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers. The king of Moab, Balak, is trying to destroy Bnei Israel. Ultimately, Moshe is looking at the land in Arvot Moab, in these sort of mountains that are east of Jordan, where he's being allowed to see the land but not enter into it. So Moab is, we hear over and over again, but Arnon is definitely directly associated with Moab over and over and over again. And since we started the discussion with threshing floors, that's interesting because what's another threshing floor we have in Tanakh? Another goren that we have in Tanakh is the one that's mentioned when Boaz, who is the progenitor of King David, is lying down with Ruth, the other progenitor of King David from that line, who is a Bat Moab. She is a daughter of Moab who came with Naomi to become part of Am Yisrael, to become part of the Yehudim, to become part of the Jewish nation. So she's a Moabite who converts, and that act of hers, that turn towards Hashem, that joining in the community of faith of the Yehudim, is this singular sign of a rare and significant choice that merits great reward in future generations, because what we get from the combination of Ruth and Boaz is the line of succession down to David, who's the son of Yishai. And so David, who's going to build the temple in a goren, in a threshing floor that was purchased from a foreign tribe or a foreign nation, or a member of a foreign nation that inhabits these lands that Bnei Israel have conquered, he's actually descended from an earlier moment where a Moabite comes and joins the nation of Israel. And so it's again this idea of someone from a foreign nation who's surprisingly and delightfully positively disposed to Am Yisrael and to Hashem. And then we see how that plays out in a positive way through the generations. So again, there's a threshing floor, right? That when Ruth and Boaz are lying down, it's at the grain harvest and it's in a threshing floor. The word goren is again mentioned. And lastly, just to keep collecting threshing floors, really the first threshing floor, I believe that's mentioned in the Torah, like in Tanakh, but even in Chumash, is that of goren ha'atad. So what is goren ha'atad? Goren ha'atad is a word, or is a name given to where it is that the sons of Yaakov mourned him when they brought this whole entourage from Mitzrayim to carry Yaakov after he's died back to Hebron to bury him in Ma'at Machpelah, in the cave of Machpelah. And it is described as a place of great mourning. So from the perspective of the Canaanim, they call it Abel Mitzrayim because they see this mourning of the Mitzrayim happening there. But the Torah calls it Goren Hatad, the threshing floor of the thorns or the briars. And there's a beautiful midrash about where that name comes from, about all these kings coming to pay honor to Yaakov and their crowns making kind of a circle of spikes or thorns around him. But the name that's given at the time in the Chumash, it's quite puzzling, and there's no explanation of what makes it a goren. And it's not 100% clear that this is the same place as Hebron, but it's definitely associated with it because this is the moment of the burial of Yaakov. And so it's certainly possible to argue that Goren Hatad, from what we have in the text itself, is being given, is an epithet being applied to Hebron or the cave of the Machpelah. And certainly the Midrash that I just mentioned about the crowns kind of confirms that. But even if it isn't exactly the same place as Hebron, it's certainly referent to Hebron because it is the moment of Yaakov's burial. They're going to immediately talk about how he's being buried in the cave of the Machpelah. So we have now this association of another goren with the cave of Machpelah, which at first seems unrelated, other than the fact that a threshing floor is mentioned with no explanation of what it has to do with this. And yet, what do we remember about the cave of the Machpelah? The cave of the Machpelah is actually the first instance where we see one of our forebears purchasing something of great significance for our nation, like a plot of land in Eretz Yisrael that's being purchased from other nations in this, early time, and this is really the earliest one with Abraham. It's being purchased, and it's going to be bought for a certain number of pieces of silver, and it's going to become this ancestral holding of our people. Even though the whole land is going to be given to us by Hashem, somehow these places we buy in particular, and as others have observed, it's ironic that they're still some of the most contested places, in a sense, as a result. So when you buy something, you can't necessarily assume that it's going to stay in the hands of your descendants, is one lesson that we learned from all of that. But in any case, you suddenly see the parallel here between Avram buying Me'arat HaMachpelah, where he goes to Ephron Hachiti, Ephron the Hittite, and he offers to purchase this cave because he wants to bury his wife Sarah, who's passed away. And there's this, back and forth. Again, Ephron is actually, everything he says, you are, a prince of God in this land among us. I won't accept any money. He ultimately does accept money, but the dialogue on the surface, again, very positive, like we have with Arwana Yevusi. And the first point I just want to make, or the point in connection with Me'arat HaMachpelah is just, if we go back to, all right, he is Ephron Hachiti, he's selling Me'arat HaMachpelah to Avraham. It is associated with Goren Ha'atad. Later, when Yaakov was buried, it may not be exactly the same place, or maybe it is exactly the same place, but in any case, Goren Ha'atad is standing there in our minds next to Hebron because of the way the text juxtaposes them. And so now this is being sold to Avraham by a Hittite. He's from Bnei Chet. We go back to the first genealogies in the Torah and ask, who are Bnei Chet? We have Uchenaan Yalad et Tzidon Bechoro Ve'et Chet. So that's one pasuk. Canaan fathered Tzidon and his firstborn Chet. Fathered Tzidon his firstborn and Chet. Ve'et HaYevusi ve'et HaEmori ve'et HaGirgashi. Okay, so now immediately after Chet, we have the Jebusites and the Amorites. So the Amorites is referenced in the name of Ornan because of what we mentioned before with Sichon and Og and all of that. That's a weaker one, but directly next to each other are Chet and HaYevusi. Okay, so we are talking about the genealogies of Canaan, and in the order of which the names are given of all the different descendants of Canaan, Het, which is Hebron and buying Me'arat HaMachpelah, is directly next to HaYevusi, which is Harabait, and David's purchase of the threshing floor of Arwana HaYevusi. So going all the way back to very early in Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, at the beginning of the Torah, we're seeing Het and Yevusi put right next to each other. And then we found that connection from a totally different direction just by saying, where are their threshing floors? David is buying a threshing floor. Where else is there a threshing floor? There's a threshing floor here in Hebron at the burial of Yaakov in Goren Hatad. And so we're being asked by the text to put these things next to each other. Put the Jebusite next to the Hittite. Put the purchase from Arwana next to the purchase from Ephron. Put Harabait next to Hebron, which is very interesting, I think, partly because it's always a bit of a puzzle what Hebron is for, according to the Torah. It's a thing that Avram does. He buys it, and we're told about that. It doesn't say that Hashem told him to do it. It has all sorts of uncomfortable implications because he wants to buy this one cave that's among this Canaanite nation, as though it has some special property that he wants to sort of purchase access to, which sounds very much like, again, participating in the idolatry of the foreign nations, which seems like it's something that Avram would want to avoid. And so there is a separate discussion we could maybe have it more late sometime. What is Hebron for? Like, what is the point of it? It's clear what Har HaBayit is for because we have all these mitzvot to do there. There aren't any mitzvot per se to do in Hebron. In fact, it's a place where dead people are buried, and so we're supposed to stay away from graves, especially Kohanim, but in general, going to graves, they're the graves of our ancestors. So yes, like it's a more appropriate thing to do to go to Hebron than it is to go to the grave of some tzaddik. But still, when we get there, there isn't an amudah, where we're given all these mitzvot of what things to do with the dead. But in any case, we are learning something here, I think, from the Torah about how to understand Har HaBayit, right? Because in the Torah itself, we're always told about the place that Hashem will decide to make his name dwell there in Sefer Dvarim, but we're not told where that is. And there's this whole question of what that place is and how it's chosen and what makes it what it is. And it may be that here, these different sources together with the theme of the goren, of the threshing floor, what it's allowing us to discover here is that there is a possible explanation or explication of that idea, the place that Hashem will make his name dwell there, that we're getting from these examples, where if we put the purchase of Har HaBayit next to the union between Boaz and Ruth, who is a Moabite, and also the purchase of Merat HaMachpelah, the cave of the Machpelah in Hebron by Abraham from the Hittites, that there's something we're supposed to understand by seeing these things together that maybe helps us get a better picture of what this is and what it means. And I don't know if this evening I have the full answer to that question. I think it's more clear that we're dealing with some objective data that are interesting, right? That point to a pattern and a relationship that needs an explanation. But I think I can try to just make an initial suggestion, and then maybe there's more that we can try to flesh out in another shiur. So one thing that I think we can say as more of an aside, just to sort of get the Hebron issue out of the way a little bit more, is that the circular aspect of the threshing floor is interesting, because there is in the Mishnah actually a statement that when you entered Har HaBayit, you're always supposed to turn to the right and then walk in that direction. And in fact, that's the case today. If you go up to Har HaBayit with a group of Jews who are being led there for tefillah, you go to the right, and you proceed around in a counterclockwise fashion, and then come back closer to where you entered. So, or at least that's happened the times that I've been there, and I suspect it's a pretty uniform practice. There's a Mishnah that talks about that practice, and mentions that sometimes people would walk in the opposite direction, and then the people who are walking in the correct or standard or conventional direction would say, "Why are you walking in the opposite direction?" And the person would say, "I'm an avel, I'm a mourner." And one of the things that just underlines for you is that mourning is a very interesting status with respect to Har HaBayit, because you're not necessarily impure, you're not tamemet, you don't have the impurity of death, but you are associated enough with death that there needs to be something a little bit against the grain in your being on Har HaBayit, because Har HaBayit is all about Elohim Chaim, it's all about life. We keep human death away from it as much as possible, but you can't say that someone who's an Avel can't go to Har HaBayit to the same degree that you can say that someone who is impure from death can't go. And so there needs to be some indication that there's something a bit out of joint about the presence of someone who's connected with death through mourning, being present in Har HaBayit. But it also, I think, emphasizes the circularity of the goren, that it's a threshing floor. There's a circular flow going through it at some level. And so it becomes this symbol also kind of the cyclicality of the sort of life cycles in creation, the agricultural cycle, the cycle of birth and death. And the resonance with goren ha'atad, the threshing floor that's associated with Hebron, which is some place that we associate with death, and the sort of mirror symmetry of that with Har-Bayit, where it's also a threshing floor, but this is the threshing floor where things go counterclockwise, and it's about life. So when we triangulate using that Mishnah, I think there is a clear sense of these may be threshing floors, but they're not the same kind of place. And although I've never seen a source, and it would be very interesting if such one existed, but I've never seen a source saying anything about the clockwise or counterclockwise direction of anything happening in Goren Ha'atad. But we can suppose that if there were such a source, that it would say things there would be going clockwise, perhaps, because they are kind of opposite to the turn right as you enter sense of rotation going on at Har-Bayit. So that's one point that really is being made as an aside. But I think that the one that really endures and that we should close on, that is more focused on the kind of day it is today on Tisha B'Av, where we're thinking about, and all of this is really about the temple, understanding the temple, understanding what it means to build it, what it means to rebuild it, is that when you look at the idea of Moab, and you look at the idea of these two different references to Moab that have to do with David and the temple, right? First, because David buys the temple mount from Ornan, who's like Arnon, which is in the land of Moab. And also this union between Boaz and Ruth HaMoaviyah, where she joins our nation, and then that combination produces this amazing thing, which is David, which ultimately is about producing the temple as well. And in between, you have this other name given to Ornan, which is Arwana, which is, again, as though he's like a corrupted or almost correct version of Aharon, Aaron, and Ha'aron, the ark, the Kodesh Kodeshim, right? I think what we learn with those different observations together is that it can both be the case that there are forms of worship that at some level are kind of close to ours or ideological cousins of ours, which are doing something that is not 100% wrong and may even be doing it on Har-Bayit. And that there is even a deeper suggestion in what we're seeing with Ruth and Boaz, which is a repeated theme in Tanakh, actually, that when you can get enough turn towards Hashem and a turn towards Am Yisrael and the Torah from a foreign nation that kind of has a genealogical heritage that originates from way back, right? Moab is descended from Lot, who is a cousin of Abraham. So at some level, Moab is kind of very, very distant family, but they become the enemy. They're trying to destroy Bnei Israel. So they're an enemy nation. They want to destroy us. But when someone from that distantly related enemy nation who wants to destroy us turns toward us and becomes a part of us and joins us, that can be the best thing possible. That can be the seed of what becomes David, Melech HaMashiach, who builds the Mikdash. And you even see a weak resonance of this in the fact that Shlomo, who was born from David, comes from Bathsheba, who's the wife of Uriah HaChiti. So you have the Hittites again being referenced in the construction of the temple. So it's again referring back to, we mentioned Ephron HaChiti. It's this theme that just keeps on kind of reflecting and resonating around in different places in these different sources surrounding the founding of the temple and its construction. But again, to emphasize, Ruth, what she stands for, what Moab stands for, what her aspect of this threshing floor, what it stands for is, if you can get Ruth to convert, so to speak, if you can get her to join the team, then that's the best thing possible, because what you can create with the new perspective and the sort of fresh zeal and all the different things that come with a true convert who has made a sincere turn towards Hashem and his Torah, what you get from that, you don't just see lying around in the sort of run-of-the-mill members of the nation. And so if you want David to build the temple, then you need someone who's kind of has a bit of a sense of alien stock in him. And that's both through Moab as just being a foreign nation that becomes part of our nation, and also going back to this whole question of Avram and Lot, and how they parted ways, but there was some kind of problem that needed to be corrected in that, and it took many generations, because this is ultimately about the unity of humanity and bringing people together, because Beit HaMikdash ultimately is meant to be a focus of worship for all of humankind, and everyone is invited to worship Hashem there. So that is one kind of notion that we get from these observations and these sources. And yet at the same time, also the reference to Moab is making another point as well, which is that as much as it might be the case that Arwana is almost Aaron, or is almost Ha'aron, that he's almost these things that are correct, and that's what's meant to be there on Har HaBayit. This Jebusite who's selling Har HaBayit to David HaMelech, he in his own way is still not doing exactly what we're doing, and to the degree that it's not according to the Torah, and it's just kind of 80% there, or however we want to put it with these anagrams, there's a qualitative difference. The Torah wants us to draw and say, look, you may as well be at some level Ephron Achiti, right? You may as well be selling a sort of a cultic location that surrounds death instead of life. And that sort of juxtaposition of Yevusi and Chet, going back to the beginning in Sefer Bereshit, is suggesting that to us as well, that ultimately you need to take this and make it that which belongs to Bnei Israel and run according to Hashem's Torah in order to correct and replace that which came before, and which was at some level picking up on something that's true. I think that's the thing we have to catch here, is that the idea that there can be a place where a nation, a Canaanite nation, is correctly apprehending that this place is the one that Hashem wanted to put his name on, right? That they understand something about the sort of spiritual geography. As much as I usually avoid using the word spiritual, I think it's appropriate here, right? That they understand something about either whether we're talking intellectually, philosophically, theologically, whatever, or whether we're talking about actual geography like place. They have figured out enough to be doing part of what we're supposed to be doing, and doing it correctly. And in one sense, that means that if we're doing things correctly, we're going to kind of go where they are and build on that. But on the other hand, Ornan or Arnon, right, it also references the idea that, look, this is a foreign nation and it tried to destroy you, right? Balak tried to destroy us, or Sichon and Og tried to destroy us. And we had to defeat them, and we had to fight them off and destroy them and conquer their land. And we had to take that land and make it the land that belongs to Bnei Israel. And that was not a partial thing, that was a complete and irreversible and an eternal thing. And it does matter at the end of the day that David had to buy this place and make it his own. And you could say that's dafka because that purchase signified that this was not participation in a pre-existing thing, but rather I bought it and now I can do what I want with it, and I'm going to do what Hashem commands me to do with it. And it doesn't matter whether what I end up doing with it happens to have 80% overlap with what you were doing. This is qualitatively different, whereas before it was, at the end of the day, a form of cultic worship that is forbidden to Bnei Israel and that will not lead humanity to the right destination. Afterwards, when David comes, he purchases it, and Shlomo builds the Mikdash there. That is the right track, and we can only get on the right track by making a clean break with the past and saying, this is something completely new. It's based on our purchase of this place. It's based on our conquest of this place. It's based on our rejection of and triumph over those who are trying to destroy us. And it doesn't really matter at the end of the day that there may be some kinship of ideology, so that they're not exactly opposite to us in their view of the world. And then it may be that there are things already that one has in common. It's still the case that the way this is to be done correctly is not for Ruth and Boaz to meet halfway and invent some new thing in the middle that's sort of half Moabite and half Israelite. And it's not for them to just say, we're basically doing the same thing anyway, so let's just kind of put on foggy glasses and not worry about details, and we will let the chips fall where they may. What needs to happen is, either for Ruth of her own accord to embrace Torah and to embrace Hashem and to join the nation of Boaz. And as we said before, in some sense, the best thing possible can come from that because it leads to David and it leads to the temple. Perhaps in part, in a sense, because the temple needs the ideological fire of what was good or correct and what the other nations were doing. But at the same time, the thing that's needed is either that or conquest, like the Ornan, the Moab kind of reference through Ornan, which is saying, look, if they come at you, you defeat them, and then now you have, or you instead, make a purchase in order to have a clean break with the past. But either way, you're building in a sense from scratch according to Hashem's instructions in the Torah, and it's not enough to say, oh, we've kind of come to slightly different conclusions about the same religious practice, so let's just kind of become a multi-religious conglomerate, and not worry too much about the differences. The Torah is extremely subtle in that it is trying to show us both that there can be more or less correct ways of getting it wrong in terms of one's relationship to Hashem, and that the nations who have a more correct relationship to Hashem at some level are an essential secret ingredient to the ultimate success that Am Yisrael are trying to build. And we need them, if we can get them to join the team in the right way. But at the same time, they'll also try to destroy us. They'll also try to keep Har HaBayit out of our hands. And the only answer to that is to win and to bring about, according to the Torah, the fulfillment of what Hashem expects of us, using the strength of that victory.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.